But to believe these three teachers, Dhammapala, Buddhadasa, and Buddhaghosa, to be the same teaching as the Buddhas, it doesn't match up very well. And I was quite concerned with it at one time. After I'd been studying the suttas for a while and seeing, wow, this is really different than what they were talking about, I went to a monk friend of mine. He was an 80-year monk. He was very, very intelligent. And I said, Bhante, I cannot take the Visuddhimagga as the Buddha's teaching. And he quite clearly said, then you can't be a Theravada monk. And I went, oh. And he said, but you can be a Buddhist monk. So I thanked him very kindly for that, and I stopped being a Theravada monk after that. I became a Buddhist monk. And she won't believe it, but this really is the definition of being a Theravada monk. You have to take 3 teachers to be the same as the Buddha. One of them was Dhammapala, that's right. He was about the 2nd century AD. So that was about 800 years after the Buddha. He started up from the Sarvastivadins, he started up Theravada. And he was in the lower south, not all the way south, but kind of midway south. And he started up a university there. And then India, yeah. And the Venerable Buddhadasa went from India to Sri Lanka because the Sri Lankans had written everything in Sri Lankan, all of the commentaries and that sort of thing. And he translated that back into Pali, but he did it with a very high, hard to understand Pali. And Buddhaghosa came along a few years later, and he had quite a mind. His mind was very sharp. He had memorized all of the Vedas. And he got involved with the teaching of Abhidhamma and Pali. And he considered himself very much an expert in Pali. And he started having these thoughts that he knew more than his teacher did. And his teacher read his mind. That's part of the danger about being around monks, because that happens occasionally. And the teacher said, now what you have to do is you have to go to Sri Lanka and go through all of those commentaries again and put them in more practical terms, easier to understand Pali. As he was on the boat going to Sri Lanka, Buddhadasa was on a boat going back to India. He just finished all of this very high, hard to understand Pali commentaries. And supposedly, I don't know how true this is, these two boats met in the middle and they discussed how would be the best way to do the translation. And then Buddhadasa left. Now, Dhammapala, he is the one, and he was quite influenced by not only Sarvastivadin philosophy, but he also had a mixture of some Mahayana in it.
Mixture of what, I'm sorry?
Mahayana. He's the one that came up with the access concentration, upachara samadhi, and moment-to-moment concentration, kanika samadhi. He's the one that said, this is the same as the apana samadhi. Apana is full absorption. So you can interchange those if you want to. Well, Buddhaghosa got to Sri Lanka and he saw the problems, and he tried to, there was 3 or 4 different sects that all had ideas, and he had tried to bring them all together as he wrote the Visuddhimagga, and he missed quite a bit. When he got to the part about meditation, he didn't know anything about meditation. He was just a scholar. But he knew what the Vedas said about meditation. And he knew what Dhammapala had said about access concentration and moment-to-moment concentration. So he mixed that all together with Buddhist words and said, meditation is meditation. It all works the same. There you are. And he's the one that influenced an awful lot of monks. During that time, the monks in Sri Lanka, there weren't so many of them, and they'd become lax. And this happens in Buddhism. There's ebbs and flows, just like in everything. And they didn't have much practice, and they didn't have much scholarship. And Buddhaghosa was really a good scholar, and he wrote in a way that really sounded right. And he came up with the 40 different kinds of meditation that the Buddha taught. He made up some of that stuff. Anyway.
Was he in a Brahmin family when he grew up?
Yes, of course. That's why he learned the Vedas.
Oh,
So he was just kind of mixing and matching and trying to make it sound Buddhist. And sometimes he would take one sentence and say, see, the Buddha said this about that, instead of going to do the whole sutta to see what the Buddha was actually talking about. So when he got done with that book, he presented it, and everybody, all the monks, got excited. Yeah, this is it. Now we're really, this tells us exactly how to meditate. Another thing that he did was he broke concentration meditation off of mindfulness meditation. So he made it like there were 2 different meditations, which doesn't agree with the suttas. And he made up all kinds of interesting observations about mindfulness. He came up with 9 insight knowledges, which later turned to 16, with the sub-commentary written by Mahasi Sayadaw. And these insight knowledges are kind of referred to a little bit in the suttas, but not as insight knowledges. The insight knowledges that you're experiencing as seeing how this process works and seeing it and getting the oh wows and letting go of old ways of thinking and being and developing new ways of thinking and being. That's what the insights are supposed to be. Buddha goes...
So how does that come across in Buddhaghosa? I understand what you're saying about the right way. So what was the twist in Buddhaghosa?
One point of concentration. And dividing the jhana practice and the mindfulness practice. He divided them. They aren't the same. And to this day, you go and you talk to a lot of people that are practicing vipassana, they will say, stay away from the jhanas. You can't attain nibbana if you practice the jhanas. And the way that they're teaching it, they're right. So this is, it gets real tricky because the Buddha was talking about one kind of jhana, Buddhaghosa was talking about another kind of jhana, and the kind of jhana the Buddha was talking about was opening your mind and being aware and seeing how the links of dependent origination actually work. And the kind of concentration and mindfulness meditation or vipassana meditation that Buddhaghosa taught, there was an overemphasis on realizing impermanence, suffering, not self. And Mahasi Sayadaw developed this method where if you get to the equanimity to formations and you start to go deeper, you see anicca 3 or 4 times very quickly, or dukkha 3 or 4 times very quickly, or anatta 3 or 4 times very quickly, and then you have a blackout. You just blank out. When you come back, your mind naturally starts to review from the second insight knowledge all of the insight knowledges and how you experienced them. So there's a lot of confidence in that kind of practice because they've seen it for themselves and it matches up with what Mahasi Sayadaw said. It doesn't match up with what the Buddha says. The Buddha says that you can, well, one of the commentaries on the Buddha's observation is you can see one or all 3 of the characteristics of existence. That is anicca, dukkha, anatta, without ever seeing the links of dependent origination. But when you see the links of dependent origination, you see each anicca, dukkha, anatta in every link. An awful lot of the people that are practicing straight vipassana, you go to the connected discourses, the Samyutta Nikaya, there's chapter number 12 is called the Nidana Samyutta. There's 84 suttas just on the practice of seeing dependent origination. And it says very clearly, if you don't know and see this as it actually is, you're not going to attain Nibbana. But when you do know and see this as it actually is, you will attain Nibbana. So Mahasi Sayadaw has used the Theravada ideas to develop what is Theravada today. And one of the definitions of being a Theravada monk, and I don't care what any other monk says, is that you have to take the Visuddhimagga to be the same teaching as the Buddha. In the Sixth Buddhist Council that happened in 1950s, that my teacher was taking part of, they put the Visuddhimagga in the Nidana Nikaya. And that's a major mistake.
Now they discuss it.
But the whole thing is, and this is where Venerable Kusala and I very much agree, mostly because he's been listening to me talk, that whatever comes out of the Visuddhimagga we have to be very cautious of, because it is misleading. And I understand this very, very well because I had 20 years of practicing the Visuddhimagga. I studied the Visuddhimagga. I knew where every... let's go to this page. It says this right here, see? And then you come to the suttas and it doesn't agree. I always went back to the Visuddhimagga instead of staying with what the Buddha taught. And it was very confusing. When I had a monk come up and tell me, you know, what you're teaching is right, but you're using the language of the Visuddhimagga and it clouds what you're saying a bit. Why don't you just use sutta language? And I was giving a retreat right after that. And I decided, I'm going to read a sutta to these folks and see what happens. I read one sutta to them. Everybody understand it. They started going deep in their practice. A lot faster than I ever did. And then with my taking the time to study the different suttas and the Anapanasati Sutta and figuring out that the standard, 3 or 4 dyads in the Anapanasati Sutta, it wasn't talking about what they said it was talking about. It was talking about being in the jhanas. And that's when I started practicing and exploring about the tightness, because in that sutta, as well as the Satipatthana Sutta, it says, on the in-breath, you tranquilize your bodily formation. On the out-breath, you tranquilize your bodily formation. Well, what does that mean? I've talked to a lot of monks and I said, look, it says this right here. When you're practicing meditation, do you do that? Oh no, I'm practicing the way my teacher tells me to practice. One-pointed concentration. So the understanding has been lost for a lot of years, and it's just now starting to come back into being again. But to believe these three teachers, Dhammapala, Buddhadasa, and Buddhaghosa, to be the same teaching as the Buddhas, it doesn't match up very well. And I was quite concerned with it at one time. After I'd been studying the suttas for a while and seeing, wow, this is really different than what they were talking about, I went to a monk friend of mine. He was an 80-year monk. He was very, very intelligent. And I said, Bhante, I cannot take the Visuddhimagga as the Buddha's teaching. And he quite clearly said, then you can't be a Theravada monk. And I went, oh. And he said, but you can be a Buddhist monk.